Hello everyone, my name is Ningyuan Song and I'm a PhD student from the University of Luxembourg. Today I'm happy to present our work on virtual agent representation for critical transactions. Contemporary virtual agents are increasingly tasked or involved with critical transactions. For instance, sometimes we let virtual agents to make financial investment decisions for us. Sometimes we let virtual agents to drive us home, which is commonly referred to as autonomous driving. These intelligent virtual agents can be of great benefit to us, and they can be represented into different forms as exemplified by the picture below. So, for instance, virtual agents can be represented only using voices. It can consist of windows, icons, menus, and pointer, which are commonly referred to as the WIMP paradigm. Virtual agents can also be represented as an object, such as the Microsoft Clippy. Virtual agents can also be represented as animals or even virtual humans. And of course, there are many other options other than the 5 examples that I listed here. But even within each categories, there can be lots of variations. So for instance, in the voice-based category, there can be male voices, female voices, and of course, all other kinds of voices. And in the animal category, there can be hundreds of thousands of species, including goats, dolphins, oxes, and cats. And depending on the specific features that we're looking at, even these subcategories can contain lots of variations. For instance, a goat can be a purple goat, a green goat, or a yellow goat. So given so much possibilities that a virtual agent can be represented, our research question is essentially to explore what are users' general preferences for virtual agent representation in the context of critical transactions. To answer the research question, we conducted a survey on the Amazon Mechanical Turk. The layout of our survey is pretty much similar to the picture below, but before participants actually doing the survey, we tell each participant that to imagine that you have a large amount of money to invest through a virtual agent. By doing so, we can contextualize the scenario as broadly as possible. In the survey, we ask participants to rank 5 different categories of agent representation, including a human representation, a humanoid representation, an organic non-human representation, an inanimate object representation, and a symbolic representation. So as you can see on the screen, from left to right, there are 5 columns marked as orange, representing 5 different categories. And at the very top of each category, there is something marked as red, called rank selection. So this is where participants rank each category. They can select a number out of 5, where 1 represents the most preferable and 5 represents the least preferable. For each category, we provide further information, including a category illustration, a category name, and 4 specific examples of different art styles, including a line drawing style, a photorealistic style, a symbolic low detail style, and a descriptive high detail style. And for these 4 specific examples, we're also trying to make them as diverse as possible in many other aspects. So taking the human category as an example, the 4 people here that we provided are diverse in their ages, in their genders, and in their races. Eventually, we recruited 100 participants from the Amazon Mechanical Turk. 85 of them were recruited without any restrictions on their backgrounds, and 15 of them were recruited based on whether they have bought video games before. And the 85 people are regarded as the test group in our experiment, and the 15 people are regarded as the control group. As you can see on the screen, the table and the figure can give an overview of our experiment results. According to this figure and this table, we can get our first observation, which is human and humanoid representation are clearly favored over other forms of representation. So if we look at the table, we can see that the human representation is ranked as 1 for 47 times in the test group and 14 times in the control group. And similar situation happens in the humanoid category as well. And the figure to the right gives a more intuitive view of the preference difference between humanoid representation and other forms of representation. The observation is further supported by statistical analysis. As you can see on the screen, we did a fragment test on the data, and we did a post hoc test and presented the results as a table. As you can see in the highlighted area in the table, there is a clear difference of preference over human category, humanoid category, and the other 3 categories. And if you look at the 2 figures at the bottom, this will give you a clear view of how people think about different forms of representation. The figure to the left shows how participants think about the human representation. In the test group, 63% of participants have selected the human representation as the most preferable. This has been even more prominent in the control group, where 93% of participants have selected the human representation as the most preferable. Similar situation occurs for the humanoid representation as well. So if you look at the figure to the right, 56% of the test group have selected the humanoid representation as either the most preferable or the second most preferable, and similar situation happens in the control group as well. If we look at the figures for the other 3 categories, we can get 2 more observations. So first, let's look at the 2 figures on the top. The figure to the left shows how people think about organic non-human representation, and the figure to the right shows how people think about the symbolic representation. As you can see, most assessments in these 2 figures are negative, which means that organic non-human and symbolic representation are not that preferable as human or humanoid representation. And now, if we look at the figure at the bottom, this figure shows how people think about inanimate object representation, and we can see that the 2 bars approximately locate in the center of the figure, which means that participants have a relatively neutral attitude toward inanimate object representation. And now, if we take a step back and look at these 5 figures from an overview perspective, we can see that the responses from the test group and the responses from the control group are roughly consistent. And it should be noted that the preference of the control group over the human representation is very prominent, and this might be due to their previous experience of interacting with human or humanoid avatars or NPCs in video games. So now we have 4 observations, and these 4 observations should give us the following conclusion, which is there is a clear dividing line between human-like representations and non-human representation variants in terms of users' preference to interact with in the context of critical transaction. So I think this actually gives us a suggestion when designing user-agent interaction in the context of critical transaction. We should perhaps opt for human representation over other forms of representation, but still it might depend on the context, which actually consists of one of our future research track following this study. So we would like to investigate the effectiveness of the human representation in different contexts. And another possible research track following this study is to look at the variations inside the human representation. There can be different types of human representation, such as a male representation or a female representation. So it is also interesting to look at how different human representations influence people's choice in the context of critical transaction. Thanks for listening, and now feel free to throw any questions you have.